Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation here on the Tattooed Historians YouTube channel. So appreciative of everyone who's going to be coming through tonight. I know there's a lot of stuff going on out there right now, and people have their eyes on multiple live streams that are happening right now. But I hope you will come and be a part of this one as we go through. I am really happy to be joined by Steve Rennie, and I was introduced to Steve through a mutual friend, and I was told, "Hey, this Steve is helping to edit a book about Ottawa baseball." And I said, "Ottawa baseball? Okay, this is new to me. I want to see what this is all about." The book is entitled "From Bytown to the Big Leagues: 150 Years of America's Pastime in Canada's Capital." And I am very happy to have Steve on tonight. Steve, how are you?
I'm doing great, John. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's awesome to have you on here, my friend. I'm so appreciative of your time. And I know that both of us have finally dug ourselves out of the snow as much as possible. And we're thinking about, a game that is quintessential spring/summer and early fall. And I'm already daydreaming about going to watch a game because of, what I read that you wrote. Tell us a little bit about your background, Steve, with why you wanted to write this particular book or edit this book and write your chapter, and how this all came about, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, so I was a journalist for many years here in Ottawa, covering politics on Parliament Hill. So I did that for about 10 years, and really great. I indulged a lot of my interests. Got to obviously do a lot of researching, a lot of writing, travel around the world, travel across Canada. But Ottawa's my home. I not born here, but spent the most of my life living in Ottawa, and I just have always had such an interest in the city and its history, and really have started developing a real love of baseball over the last few years, and wanted to know a bit more about the game and how it happened here. Because when you think about baseball in Canada, if you think about it at all, you tend to think about baseball in southern Ontario, and sort of Hamilton, Woodstock, London, Guelph, and those areas, where the game has a very, very long history. And you might think about more recent history in Toronto with the Jays, or in Montreal with the Expos. But Ottawa kind of always gets overlooked. And, if you talk to people about baseball in Ottawa, maybe they'll remember our AAA team from the 90s, the Ottawa Lynx. And if they're of a certain vintage, they may remember the AAA teams that were here with the Athletics and the Giants farm teams in the 50s. But after that, you'd be really hard pressed to find anyone who knows any more about the history of the game here. And I wanted to know more. And when did it start? How did it start? And how did the game develop? And when I started looking into it, I found that the game actually goes back to at least 1865, but probably even beyond that. So it's been here a long time, and it's just a story that I felt needed to be told. And I'm really glad that we were able to get the book together, because I think that there's some great stories in there about how the game started, how it grew, and where it is today.
Yeah, I have seen people reenact 19th century baseball. It's a thing that I've gone and I've watched them and I've enjoyed it, and talked to them about the rules and all kinds of stuff that had changed over the generations of baseball. And a lot of us, when we think of early baseball, we think of these teams that are in New York State or Pennsylvania or Maryland, and we think of the Mid Atlantic a lot, and in some New England teams, not thinking about what's going on in Southern Ontario and how things transpire there and how things move from New York up to Ottawa. What was that kind of? What was the starting point for trying to piece this puzzle together, Steve? Where you're like, not only is there a story here, but I got to find a connection with these other places that are kind of intertwined with Ottawa and other areas of Canada.
Well, one of the places I started was looking at sort of the Prescott, Ogdensburg area. So Prescott on the Canadian side of the border, and Ogdensburg on the American side, because we know that the game was being played in New York and New York State, in the 1850s, 1860s. And it seemed natural that there was a lot of cross-border traffic. There was a ferry that crossed, connecting those two cities. So it seemed plausible that baseball would migrate across the border. And in fact, that is the case. There were games, in that part of the United States as early as 1860. And it wasn't very long before they kind of looked across the river and said, hey, we should probably try playing those guys over there and see if we can get a game going. And one of the actually really interesting things I was able to find was that one of the very first international games took place in 1860 between a team from Prescott and a team from Ogdensburg. So there's a team that was called the Greenville Baseball Club of Prescott, but it was actually probably a typo. I think it was called Grenville because that's the name of the county over there. So the Grenville Baseball Club. And they played the Empire Club in Ogdensburg in September of 1860. That would have only been a few weeks after what's recognized as the first cross-border game that took place in Southern Ontario in August. So not very long after. So it's got a really, really long history. And it got me thinking, well, okay, so we know that baseball tended to spread because of rail lines. If you look at sort of the spread of the game, you can trace it pretty closely to the expansion of the railways in the 1800s. And there was a railway that was built in Ottawa in the 1850s that basically went from Ottawa to Prescott, and then you could take a ferry across to Ogdensburg and continue on from there. And so it seemed natural to me that maybe that's how the game started to spread. And that's my hypothesis anyway, that the game maybe migrated its way from upstate New York, came to Prescott, and then teams could now jump on the railway and be in Ottawa in 3 hours. And it wasn't very long before that's the way that the game started to spread.
It's really a great look at the border in general, because I've talked with other students in the past about the porous nature of the border, where you have families on opposite sides of the border, you have friends, you might work on the other side of the border at this time. Maybe the border to you isn't even a thing you think about. You just cross over the St. Lawrence or something to go to work or go see family. It would be natural for you to say, hey, I want to play against my friends on the other side of the border who may not have as much experience playing baseball as me, and maybe I could get one up on them. And the idea of the railroads coming into play is definitely something that we've seen in barnstorming in the 1920s and other times, right? When we see this growth start to happen, Steve, and we see the late 1800s start coming to fruition, and Ottawa is starting to say, hey, we don't want to be left out in the cold with this. How does this whole thing with Ottawa baseball really start to progress? How do they start to grow it from these guys running our side of the border and want to come play to having a team that's really, symbolic of Ottawa for a while?
Yeah, well, I mean, it took a few more years before the game really started to take hold in the Ottawa area. So the first documented game that I was able to find took place at a picnic in 1865, the fall of 1865. And what's interesting to me about that is that it's, there's no references to baseball in any of the Ottawa newspapers prior to that. So not talking about baseball happening in the United States or elsewhere, it's not really being covered in the Ottawa newspapers. But the way it's presented in this article is very sort of matter of fact. It's listing all these different activities that took place at the picnic, and baseball's one of those, along with cricket and other things. And that's interesting because it tells me that people were already familiar with the game. They didn't have to say, and they were playing this new game that involved a ball and a bat and bases, and they didn't have to describe it. People were just assumed to know what baseball was. So that was interesting to me. And the fact that they even played baseball suggested to me that they would, if they knew how to play it, it had been around for at least a little while. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking that probably before 1865 it was being played, but this just happened to be the first sort of reporting of it. But it was really only 2 years later, in 1867, when Ottawa had its first real team. So a team called the New Dominion Club was formed in 1867. They probably took their name from the newly formed Dominion of Canada, which is in 1867 we became a country. And they really took it upon themselves to just dive right in. So their first game, they went to Ogdensburg. They didn't play, well, they perhaps played local teams, but it wasn't covered in the newspapers. But the first game I was able to find was a complete blowout that happened when they traveled across the border to Ogdensburg in 1867. So they lost very badly. It was, I think the score was something like 141-20. So not close. And that's really reflective of the high scores of the time. You know, you see a lot of these really large scores that would just kind of be hard to even imagine today. And there's reasons for that. You know, they didn't have gloves, and you know the game really favored the batters, because you know pitching wasn't really meant to strike people out. It was, you know, kind of lobbing the ball gently to them, as you would kind of when you're playing with your kid in the backyard. Um, so you get these high scores. What's interesting to me about that game, though, is that it's clear that baseball is still a new thing for Ottawa, because the players, you know, the newspaper makes some comments about, you know, the players don't really seem to know the rules very well. They made a lot of errors that they probably shouldn't have made. But if they're really good athletes, and if they come back in a year with some more experience under their belts, you know, we'll be in for a tougher test. And that was in fact the case. So the next year, the New Dominion Club is the preeminent baseball club in Ottawa. It's probably one of the only baseball clubs in Ottawa. It's got a membership of 60 people, so it's considerable. A lot of people are now members of the club. They don't have people to play really, though, so there's a lot of inter-squad games. They ended up having to play themselves a lot because they just couldn't find teams to play. When they did play people, they tended to play different workplace teams. So they played groups of mechanics or other you know, occupations. But they did play Ogdensburg a couple more times, and they had a closer game in July of 1868. They were actually ahead for quite a while, and then they ended up losing. But it was close. And then they played them again in August. Wasn't you know, that one was a little more lopsided for Ogdensburg. But I think Ottawa was a little disappointed that they weren't able to build on the momentum of the earlier game. But that's really sort of the first real club, and this is now getting baseball kind of in people's minds. But then the club just sort of vanishes after 1868. There's a mention of them the next year, but then you don't hear anything from them for another 3 years. And in the interim now, other teams are starting to form. So a team called the Ottawa Baseball Club kind of takes the mantle as the main club in the city, and other ones are forming too. But you know, kind of going through some of these old newspapers, you kind of there's this one article that reveals what happened to the New Dominion Club. And in fact, what had happened was they had a clubhouse that's in what's now the downtown part of the city, and I guess their clubhouse was subdivided into lots so they could build houses and buildings and things like that, and so they just didn't have a place to play, and they just ended up you know, going out of closing up the club. And so you see sort of that period of the early 1870s now. You know, baseball's starting to take hold, but it's still it's only 1872 before Ottawa really gets the baseball craze, and that's because the Boston Red Stockings came to the city for the first of what'll be 2 years back to back of them coming to visit.
That's really an incredible history, because I often thought of this as I was reading through the book about the classes that are involved in this. It's a lot of blue collar, as we would say, workers who are getting together to play this game. You see some of the richer folks who may be funding or helping to buy some equipment, a bat or something as you go along. I've read certain stories about that on the side, but this is really like a working class kind of game. And when you have somebody like the Boston Red Stockings coming up, it had to be just an electric kind of atmosphere, because that would draw in a crowd, wouldn't it?
Huge, and they needed a place to play. That was the biggest problem. There weren't really any big fields where they could have a game against the Red Stockings. So as soon as they found out that the Red Stockings were going to be coming in August of 1872, the Ottawa Baseball Club scrambled. So they needed to find land. So they found 10 acres on the very southern edge of the city. It's funny now to think of it as being the southern edge of the city, because it's actually kind of not too far from downtown. It's in this area called the Golden Triangle now, which is right along the Rideau Canal. So it's a really beautiful area. But at the time, it was actually a city of its own, or a town of its own. And so they were able to lease this land, and they very hastily constructed this big 10-acre field, and they turned it into a baseball diamond. So they had a big fence around it. They had clubhouses. They had places where you could sell refreshments, although they made it clear they weren't selling any alcohol at the stadium. It was a dry stadium in that sense. And so they built it in record time and got it up and running. And when the Red Stockings came in, it was really quite a thing. It was a public holiday, first of all, so everybody was off work and they could go watch the baseball game in the afternoon. In the morning, this touring group of English gentlemen cricketers had played a game at Rideau Hall, where the Governor General's residence is. And so a lot of people went to that in the morning to see the cricket match. And then in the afternoon came to see the Red Stockings. And if you read the newspaper accounts at the time, people were just mesmerized to see the Red Stockings step off their bus. So if you can imagine it, it's basically a horse-drawn bus that pulls this team into the baseball field, and they step off the bus, and people are looking at them, and they've got their uniforms on with their red socks and the belts, and they look like professionals, and they're muscular, they're athletic, they just look like professional baseball players. And on the other side of the field are a bunch of people who are from Ottawa with different jobs. It's very much like as if the New York Yankees came and played your office softball league team.
Right.
That's kind of the analogy, and the score kind of bore that out. Like the Red Stockings just completely obliterated the Ottawa team, 64-0, not close. The Red Stockings team too had some really fantastic players in their lineup, so it's not actually a big shocker that they ended up beating Ottawa. They had Harry Wright and George Wright and Albert Spalding, all future Hall of Famers. Ross Barnes, who was a hitting champion a few years later, was also in the lineup. So, Ottawa didn't stand a chance. But it really got people excited about baseball in a way that they had, baseball had been popular or starting to become popular. But when the Red Stockings came, it took it to a whole nother level. And then the next year, they came back and they played again. And Ottawa had fared a little bit better. So they lost 44-4 this time. So not as much of a blow as the first time. But it was, still another way to get people really excited in the game. And, it was a really good way for this game to spread and get more popular in the city. So that was really kind of what took it to the next level. And then you see over the course of the 1870s and 1880s, there's all kinds of teams that are popping up, and the way that they sort of challenge each other was a lot of times through the newspaper. So you would see these accounts in the newspaper where it's such and such has formed a club, or this club is formed and they're seeking any challengers, and then a few days later there'd be a reply saying, well, this team accepts your challenge and will play anytime, any place, kind of thing. Like, it seems very much like pro wrestling in a sense. We'll take you on anywhere, anytime. and then the newspapers kind of document the negotiation. Well, we'll play on this date. Well, that doesn't work for us. We'll play on this date. And eventually the game happens and it's covered, and then there's a rematch, and it kind of goes from there. So there was a lot of that in the papers at the time. So it was fascinating reading and researching that kind of stuff.
It's really a great look at media coverage of sports and media history, because you're watching it play out in these columns on the newspaper, and now we're watching it on a YouTube video, or watching it on a TikTok or something else, where we see the behind the scenes of baseball, if you will, or any other sport, and it must be really interesting as a former journalist to see this in action, because you have that experience as a journalist.
Yeah, it's interesting to see who they chose to cover and why they chose to cover it. I have no doubt that other games were happening and that other people were playing, and so you're looking at why are these people being covered, and who are they? Who are the reporters interested in writing about and reporting on? And then it's also feeding into this appetite that people had for baseball coverage. People were very, very interested in learning more about the game, and it went from a period where 10 years prior you couldn't find a single mention of baseball in the newspapers in Ottawa, and all of a sudden now you're finding many, many references to the game and how it's happening. So, and people are really interested. I mean, the fact that they were covering in such granular level of detail the negotiations between teams for games that were going to be played speaks to people's level of interest in the game. So it was really interesting to see. So it's it's kind of like what it would be today, following along, like you say, on TikTok or Twitter or any of the social media to see these updates that are happening right now in real time. That would have been sort of their equivalent of these things happening in real time.
Yeah, I'm just picturing in my head right now like a late 19th century Sports Center skit going on with people dressed up as late 19th century people covering this whole thing. I think that would be a tremendous skit to go along with this. Maybe it's just me, I don't know, but that the idea of having this big team come in and really prop up a sport, that speaks volumes, because we've seen this in other places around the world. You know, that we've seen the rise in Japan with baseball and stuff like that, because other teams had come in and kind of said, "Hey, we'll show you the ropes a little bit, or we'll show you up for a day, and then you got to figure it out on your own." Was there any kind of feedback, Steve? Did you ever locate any feedback from the Boston side of that, where they're like, "Hey, we went up there and took on this team, and we're thinking about going back next year"? Or was there any coverage from that side of the border at all?
They were impressed with the quality of the field, so they did like
Hmm.
the stadium that Ottawa was able to build. So there was some positive feedback on that. But for them, you have to keep in mind this is just one stop on a many stops on a tour that they were doing. So they were,
Hmm.
barnstorming team. They'd go to all parts of, New York and all over Ontario and Massachusetts, and all these places where baseball was happening, and they'd play the local teams. So um, I'm sure for them, a lot of these guys had never been to Ottawa before, and so that would have been probably interesting for them. And from what they saw and from all accounts, they seemed to like the city. I don't suspect they thought very much of the competition, to be honest. But for them, it's an easy day at the office. You can go, have a walk away happy, and what they would tend to do after is they'd have these banquets. Baseball was sort of very civilized affair back in that time, where the teams would play, and then after you would go out and you'd put a big feast on, and there'd be toasts and stories and songs and things like that, and kind of go late into the night, and lots of celebrating and things like that. So for them, great experience. Get to go, beat up this Ottawa team for a couple hours, and then go get to have a nice meal afterwards. So I'm sure they probably enjoyed it quite a lot.
Yeah, and you can travel around and see new places, and maybe sign a couple autographs at that time.
Yeah,
Who
it's a great
knows?
job if you can get it.
Yeah, it's a great gig. So I posted the photo for this event that you provided from the Baseball Hall of Fame, the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and I had a couple people give me some feedback on who's this baseball team with pipers, and I said, well, you need to tune in to find out about the Ottawa Senators. Uh, Steve, you sent me that glorious picture, and I've passed it on to others. And now people really want to know, how did the Ottawa Senators come into being?
It's an interesting story, and it starts in Rochester, of all places. So Rochester had a team in the Eastern League in 1898, and the Spanish American War was going on, and it was putting a real strain on baseball attendance. People weren't going to the games as much. And the Rochester team was really struggling, and attendance was down, and they were thinking that, they have a couple of options. They could either close up the team, or they could relocate the team. And relocation was sort of the better option. Just to pause here for a sec, you've got to feel really bad for Rochester, because the year before they were in a similar situation and lost their team to Montreal. So the Rochester team had relocated to Montreal the year before. They get the team back the next year and find themselves in the same situation, and now they're being relocated. And so there's a few different cities that were under consideration. Worcester, Massachusetts was one of them, but Ottawa is the one that's chosen. And it's chosen largely because the local newspaper, the Ottawa Citizen, single-handedly started a campaign to bring professional baseball to the city. And it took the form of a few columns in the newspaper. So, there's an article that pops up where the editorial board is saying, look at all these teams in the Eastern League. There are many cities that are much smaller than Ottawa, less affluent than Ottawa, and yet they've got teams. And here we are, we're the capital of Canada. We have lots of people living here. We're a fairly prosperous and wealthy city. We should have baseball. And so over the next number of weeks, there's a number of articles that appear in the paper where they're really pushing this agenda. We should bring baseball to Ottawa. And even the mayor kind of gets on board at that point, Samuel Bingham, and he's, at first he's saying, well, I don't really know much about this baseball thing, but it sounds great. And if it would bring some economic impact to the city, I'd be all for it. And that was sort of the tack that the papers and the politicians took was, look, this is a great opportunity to get people to become aware of Ottawa, become aware of potentially investment opportunities of coming to, when they come to Ottawa, they can see, there maybe is opportunity to invest here and start a business, and it could be a good thing. Baseball could be a way that we could leverage some of that. And so they go on this campaign, and the Eastern League agrees that yes, Ottawa can be the city that Rochester relocates to, and so they do. And so it's all kind of very hastily comes together. The team is playing in the Rochester team is playing in Syracuse, and they kind of get the word that, hey guys, you got to pack up and go because you're in Ottawa now. You got to move. And so they scramble, go back home, grab their things, jump on a ferry. It's this very sort of long trip. They have to cross the river and then take the train, and it's a bit of an ordeal. The ferry is very, like, it's a rocky trip, so people are getting seasick. It's not pleasant. But they get to Ottawa and they're met by hundreds and hundreds of people at the train station who are just cheering, and they're really excited to see this new team. And so it's a really, really big deal for the city. And their first game takes place at Lansdowne Park. So Lansdowne Park is, if you're not familiar with Ottawa, it's a big area. Now it's our football stadium, and we have a hockey arena there too for our junior team. But it's right on the Rideau Canal by Bank Street, sort of one of the main thoroughfares in the city. Really beautiful spot. Sport's been played there for a really, really long time. And so they play there for the first game, and they're wearing their old Rochester uniforms. So they're not wearing those kind of tartan ones that you saw in the picture yet. And it's a real mishmash because like letters are falling off a lot of the players' uniforms. So, some say Rochester, some just say Chester, some say Roche. Like they're this kind of alphabet soup of lettering on their uniforms. And they play only 2 games at Lansdowne, and then they have to move to another field because the cricket team actually had a lease on the field, and they couldn't play at Lansdowne because the cricket team was already playing there. And so they moved to this new grounds, and they're playing there, and people are kind of interested in seeing them. But a local tailor looks at them and says, "Look, you can't play in these uniforms. Like we need to really outfit you in something special." And so he creates these tartan uniforms, which may be the only tartan uniforms certainly the only ones I'm aware of. There may be other ones, but I've not seen them. And they're sort of very well regarded by the Ottawa press, and virtually everywhere else. Like they're panned. The comments range from, sort of like gently saying, maybe, it's interesting uniforms the Ottawa players have, to, outright they look ridiculous, or they're ugly, or they're hideous, like these kinds of things. So it's universally panned outside of Ottawa. And they play they're at about like a 500 level until about August. So they're doing okay. They're not doing great, but they're not they're not awful either. But they're losing a lot of money. And the owner of the team makes an appeal to the people of Ottawa in August of that year to say, look, if you don't start coming out to see these games, I'm not going to be able to keep a team here much longer. We might not even make it to the end of the season. And it's hard to get people to come out to see a losing team. Like that's true today. If your team's not doing well, it's hard to get people out to watch. And they go on this horrendous losing streak towards the end of August, and as a result, people have just stopped going to the games. They don't want to spend their money to see it. And then they make it to the end of the season. They don't fold, but they don't come back. And there's reports that the team has lost, in the span of 6 weeks, they lost about $4,000, which doesn't seem like a lot now, but in 1898 money, that's quite a lot of money to lose in such a short period of time. And that's it. And so then they fold up, and there's no more team in Ottawa for a long time. The interesting thing to me, though, about this was that the name of the team was always sort of presented on websites and in some books as the Wanderers. And there's no reports from the time of the team ever being called the Wanderers. I think that it was probably something that was applied at a later date. Wanderers was typically something that you'd see in hockey, where a lot of teams would move around in that period of time. They kind of from city to city, and Wanderers was kind of a name that was used in that, and it's used in soccer in England too, in some cases, but not for this team. But there are many references to the team being called the Senators, and that's interesting because they would have been the first Ottawa sports team to be referred to as the Senators as their name, not the hockey team that came a decade later, but this baseball club was the Senators, the original Senators. And so you can see all these newspaper accounts where it's, the Senators had a great game today, or the Senators played well, or it's not even a debate. Like, it's when you start looking through it, you see, like, no, very clearly this was the Senators.
Mhm. Was there a team in Washington at the time called the Senators, Steve, or was that later?
No, that was at the same time, and that's actually where the name came from. So a Toronto sports writer said, "Look, the capital of the United States has a team, and they are called the Senators. We should do the same for our capital. We have a team now in Ottawa. Let's call them the Senators." And that's where it kind of came from. And then you could see the Ottawa sports writers picked up on that, and that was the name that stuck.
That would have been an interesting game if they would have played each other,
Yeah,
played for the name,
yeah,
and see what
exactly.
would happen. Was there any kind of cricket was the sport that people went out and watched for hours on end, and I don't understand it, but I was born in America. I don't understand cricket, but was there any kind of friction going on there between the two, Steve, where like people understood what was going on with cricket? It was the safe bet, so to speak, to go to a cricket match. You knew what to expect, and people knew it drew in a crowd compared to baseball. Was it kind of, for some people, was it kind of maybe too new or too foreign at the time, to think about? Was there kind of like any kind of friction there that you found, or is that just something that maybe some people have discussed and there's not really any kind of primary source material on that?
No, it was certainly discussed. You can look at the papers from the time, and there was a lot of, especially in Ottawa, there was some discussion about, baseball has now surpassed cricket as the preeminent sport. There was this tension that you would see or debate that would happen in the papers about, what is the main sport, what is the best sport right now, and cricket was presented as sort of this. Yes, it's a game that's been around for a long time, but it's kind of out of date now. And baseball is the thing. It's shorter. It's more action. Um, it's a little easier to understand. And so that was sort of the debate that was happening in the newspapers. And cricket was still a part of the city. Lots of people played cricket, and still do. But it was becoming less and less of the game that really captured people's imaginations, right? Like, yes, there were cricket teams, and they did play, and they were covered in the newspapers. But baseball was the thing that was just, it was a craze that was sweeping all of North America, and Ottawa was no exception. People got really swept up in baseball. It was a little easier to get into, and that's, I think, that you could see it's that's just kind of how it's spread in Ottawa. And certainly after the 1800s, there's not as many reports of cricket matches that are happening, but obviously baseball is still going on. So at the time, yeah, it definitely a debate that was raging, but I think people were really kind of more lenient to baseball.
Now, for my American audience, there's a lot of baseball history going on here, not only in Ottawa but in Southern Ontario, as Steve alluded to, and a lot of my American audience don't realize that there's a Hall of Fame in Southern Ontario, a baseball Hall of Fame. Can you touch on that kind of cultural thing, Steve, where this is within the fabric of Ontario and Canada as well, where we don't usually think about baseball as a whole in Canada outside of maybe the Blue Jays or something like that, if you are from places like America or other areas.
Yeah, so the reason it's in St. Mary's, the Hall of Fame, is because that's the spot of a place where a gentleman named Adam Ford would have lived. And Adam Ford's important because he claims to have witnessed a baseball game that took place in the area, so around the St. Mary's area, in 1838, which would have put it a year before the now debunked Abner Doubleday inventing of baseball in 1839. The Adam Ford story and the Abner Graves story, the Abner Doubleday, the gentleman who perpetuated the Abner Doubleday myth, They have a lot of similarities. So they're both, they kind of come about where these guys, many, many years after the fact come back and say, oh, back in the case of Adam Ford, almost 50 years ago, I saw this game happen in Beachville. And so he describes in really minute detail, the length of the distance between the bases and the names of every player on the team and the rules in really meticulous level of detail, something that he would have seen when he was 7 years old, and now it's 48 years later and he's just remembering in this, really vivid amount of detail. So it's a little suspect. There's nothing to say that it did not happen, but there's also no other sources to say that it did happen. So you kind of have to take him at his word. And there's been sort of research that has been done into it, and nobody has been able to disprove any of what he says. It's just you kind of have to suspend belief a little bit to think that anybody could remember that level of detail almost 50 years after the fact. It's similar to the Doubleday myth. So Abner Graves, same thing. In around turn of the century, there's a real push by Albert Spalding to present baseball as a uniquely American creation. And he's received a letter from this man named Abner Graves who says, my friend Abner Doubleday actually invented baseball in Cooperstown. He sketched out the diamond and wrote out the rules, and it's all it's completely fabricated. It's not true at all. Abner Doubleday wasn't even living in Cooperstown when this was said to have happened, so it's since been debunked. But very similar in nature to the Canadian story. Now, what's actually interesting is Abner Graves and Adam Ford both would have overlapped each other. They both lived in Denver, Colorado for a while, so it's not clear if they knew each other, had met each other, maybe had even kind of swapped stories. That's something that's been speculated. Did they ever bump into each other and say, hey, I remember this game when I was a kid in Beachville, Ontario, and maybe Abner Graves kind of took that upon himself to sort of invent a story as well. But anyway, so that's sort of this. So Southern Ontario's got this rich history, but it actually has beyond this Beachville game. You've got teams in places like Guelph and London and Hamilton and all these other cities in Southern Ontario, and baseball is really, really popular there. And I think a lot of that is again, you've got a lot of cross-border. A lot of people coming up from Buffalo and from Detroit and those areas, and baseball is spreading, and the railways are certainly helping with that as well. But it's got a really, really long history in Southern Ontario and a very rich history, and it's still incredibly popular in that part of the province even today. We have our inter-county baseball league that's got a lot of teams that are in that area, and every summer they play, and it's a really big deal in Southern Ontario.
What's it been like, Steve, to put this research out there when you're speaking to groups? What has that experience been like for you?
Well, I think what's been interesting to me is just not a lot of people are aware of the Ottawa history. So to the extent that people are aware of any baseball history, it typically is New York or United States kind of focused, and if they know anything of Canada, typically will be like the Jays or the Expos and things like that. Mm-hmm. So what's interesting when I talk to people about it is, they say, "Oh, I didn't really realize that Ottawa had that history. I didn't know that it went back that far. I didn't know that this was such a big part of people's lives back then." And I think that's what stands out to me most. It's yes, the game is interesting and how it spread is certainly interesting, but the role it played in people's lives at the time and what it says about us as a city in the late 1800s is really, really interesting. You can see that this, it really was sort of a focal point and a really unique way of sort of building community and kind of bringing people together. And you can see that because offices are, these are people who are working really long hours, and then they still get together with their office mates to play against another group of professionals or another team from somewhere else that in the evenings. And there's people are, it's a real focal point, a real thing that draws people together. So it's really interesting just to see how that kind of was such a focal point of Ottawa's history back then.
So the book itself, Steve, what are some things that you are really excited about people reading in the book? Well, we want them to read the whole book, but I mean, what are some stories that you really, or personalities that you really liked to read about in this book, From Bytown to the Big Leagues?
Well, I mean, so there's the things we've talked about, but I think even if you look to the more recent past, the history of the Ottawa Lynx it's really fascinating to me. As someone who grew up watching the Lynx, going to the games, it was a big part of me growing up seeing the Lynx. And there's some really interesting stories there about how the team came to Ottawa, how that whole situation played out, and how they chose the site of what's now the stadium, because like there's a lot of talk about excuse me for that. Um, one of the challenges I think that has always struck Ottawa is that our stadium is kind of a little bit out there. It's not easy to get to. And so there's stories about, the mayor was driving and looked to the site of what was then, an old snow dump, and said to his driver, whose name was Snake, "Hey, Snake, that's the perfect place for a baseball diamond." And, that's the story that is told. And, that's it, where the stadium is. So, yeah, lots of really interesting stories in there about the Lynx. If you're interested at all in sort of the other AAA teams that we've had, the 50s, there's some great stuff in there. And obviously more recent history too with all our independent league teams. So lots of great stuff in there as well. So, and some key players, people who have been big parts of the city's baseball history. So people either who were born here and went on to play in the majors, or had a real hand in just popularizing the sport here.
Yeah, for everyone who didn't hear the full title earlier when we did the introduction, the book is called From Bytown to the Big Leagues, 150 Years of America's Pastime in Canada's Capital. I really enjoyed it because I did play baseball as a kid. And once I don't know what it is, once you play baseball, it just doesn't leave your blood in a way. I've heard so many people say similar things. I still remember what the bat felt like in my hand when I was a kid and stuff like that. It's just a strange thing to think about. There's an aura to it that is just lovely. And Steve, I have to ask you this before we wrap up here. How are the Jays going to do this year? We're starting off pretty tough with the Vladdy thing.
Yeah, that's going to be really tough. I think everybody was hoping that they would come to an agreement and sign him, but looks like that's not going to happen, or may not happen. Before he becomes a free agent. So that's going to be tough. I mean, they've been in the toughest division in baseball for a really long time. It's really hard to compete with the Yankees and the Red Sox now are they're doing better, and the Orioles have just been phenomenal the last few years. They've done a really great job of building up their team and creating a real pipeline of talent that's coming through now and really starting to take hold there. So, and Tampa Bay, you can't count them out. It's just amazing what they do with so little, with so few resources down there. So the Jays they're in a tough spot. So I am an optimist, and I hope that they'll be successful, but I think that it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle for them this year.
See, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I was always a fan of the Jays because we spent summers in Canada, but I was mainly surrounded by Pittsburgh Pirates stuff. And we always said they're the best AAA team in professional baseball because people would start there and then move on. And I'm like, please, Jays, don't end up being like that. That's the one thing I'm afraid of. Barry, welcome in. Thank you for being here. I remember seeing the Lynx play the Tidewater Tides. Oh, there's a name I haven't heard of in a while. The Tidewater Tides. Thank you, Barry.
Yeah.
That's neat. That's neat. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Yeah, hopefully the Jays do well this year. Steve, where can everyone purchase the book or get a copy of the book?
So you can get it Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any of the big online booksellers have it there. If you go to the Society for American Baseball Research, you can also buy it directly from them. They were good enough to publish the book. So I think it's saber.org is the website you can go to for that, SABR. And yeah, you can get ebook, you can get hard copies. So yeah, really anywhere where fine books are sold.
And I'm going to put a link in the video description, everybody, as soon as we are offline, so that you can go below and grab a copy of that. Steve, I greatly appreciate your time this evening talking about some baseball history. It's good to have some baseball history on here. Where are you heading next to talk about the book, or what's on the trail for you next?
So I'll be doing another podcast in March. We'll be going around to different sites of note in Ottawa. So going to some of the places I've talked about today. So the site of the first stadium, and a few other places of note. So we'll be doing that in March. And then in April, I'll be going to Cooperstown again. So I was there last year talking about Ottawa baseball as part of the 19th century baseball convention that they hold every year. This year, I'll be going to talk about my next book, which is on baseball during the Klondike Gold Rush. So I've been working on that for the last year and a bit. And so I'll be presenting my research there. And yeah, hopefully people will be interested.
Do you have a favorite player in the Hall?
I don't. I don't really have a favorite player in the Hall of Fame. What I loved when I was there though was that picture of the Ottawa team in the plaid. Like it's amazing to see that picture surrounded by all this other baseball history. I think that just blew me away because it just made that connection to my hometown just that much stronger. And so it was really, really amazing to see that.
Do you know how much I want a reproduction of that uniform to wear around? Just, I don't care if people pick on me; it's fine. But it is amazing, and to see bagpipers with them is just awesome.
Yeah, it's neat because there's I don't know if you're aware, there's a website called Threads of Our Game, and it's a gentleman named Craig Brown who takes old newspaper articles and reproduces what these uniforms would have looked like back then, because obviously they didn't have color photographs, so you couldn't see them. And so this Ottawa one he's done, so I've helped him that. So it's kind of grays and reds and blacks and whites. I think there's some tan in there as well. So it's quite the collage of different colors. It really does look like a pair of pajamas. So maybe you could get the sort of the pajama version of that or something.
If it only would have pulled them out of the slump, that's all it would have been, But Steve, thank you again so much for coming on and beaming in from snowy Ottawa. The snow might be melted from the snow dump by the time you get out there to look around, but I don't know. It might be around a while.
Yeah, I think it'll be a while before it melts. Right now, it's the banks at the end of my driveway are taller than I am, so I think it'll be a while before it melts away.
Yeah, I think so. We'll be out by June or July.
Exactly.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Greatly appreciate the live chat here. I'm sure many of you are going to be tuning in later on. And I hope that you will grab a copy of the book. As I said, I'm going to put a link in the description so that you can grab your copy ASAP. Steve, thank you again for being here. I appreciate you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, John.
You're very welcome. Take care, everybody. Be well, be safe, and keep reading.